The phone rang at 6:47 in the morning, and the voice on the other end was one I never expected to hear again, the voice of the woman who once called me not good enough for her daughter, now asking me for help in a tone I didn't recognize, broken, desperate, and afraid. If you believe people deserve second chances, and that kindness can rebuild what pride once tore down, hit that like button, drop a comment below, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next will stay with you long after the video ends. My name is Daniel, and 3 years ago I was engaged to a woman named Claire. We had built a life together, or so I thought, complete with shared dreams, a small apartment above a bakery, and a future that felt solid enough to stand on. Her mother, Margaret, never approved of me. I was a contractor, someone who worked with his hands, and in her eyes that made me temporary, disposable, a placeholder until someone better came along. When Claire left me for a man with a law degree and a corner office, Margaret didn't hide her relief. She told Claire, within earshot of me, that she'd finally come to her senses. I packed my tools and my pride into the same battered truck and drove away from that house without looking back, promising myself I'd never return. 3 years is enough time to rebuild a life, but not enough to forget the sting of being told you weren't worthy of one. I had built a modest fencing and carpentry business since then, working long hours, taking jobs that paid the bills and occasionally one that fed the soul. So when Margaret's number flashed on my screen that morning, my first instinct was to let it ring out. But something in the second ring made me answer, maybe curiosity, maybe the quiet hope that people can change. Her voice was thin, cracked at the edges like old paint. She said her back fence had collapsed in the storm the week before, and she needed it fixed before the county came to inspect the property line. She didn't apologize for the past. She didn't explain why she'd called me specifically out of every contractor in the county. She just asked, plainly, if I could come take a look. I told her I'd stop by that afternoon, more out of professional obligation than any warmth toward the woman who once made me feel like dirt on her daughter's shoe. When I pulled into her driveway, the house looked smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling slightly, the garden that used to be immaculate now overgrown with weeds pushing through the cracks of the walkway. Margaret answered the door herself, and the sight of her stopped me cold. The woman who once stood tall and sharp-tongued was thinner now, her hands trembling slightly as she gestured toward the backyard. She moved slower, carefully, like each step cost her something. I said nothing about the change. I simply followed her to the fence, took measurements, and told her I'd need about 3 days to replace the damaged sections properly. She nodded and then said something that caught me off guard. She asked if I would consider staying not just to fix the fence, but to help with a few other things around the house that had fallen into disrepair, the gutters, a loose porch step, a leaking faucet in the kitchen. She said she'd make it worth my while, and there was something in the way she said it, not transactional but pleading, that made me pause. I agreed, though I couldn't yet understand why she was asking me, of all people, for help. Over the following days, I learned pieces of her story the way you learn the shape of a room in the dark, slowly, by bumping into things. Claire's father had passed away 18 months earlier, and not long after, Claire herself had moved across the country for work, calling her mother less and less as the months wore on. Margaret was alone in a house too big for one person, with a body that was beginning to fail her in small, humiliating ways, and a pride too stubborn to ask her only daughter for help. She hadn't called me because I was the only contractor available. She'd called me because I was the only person who might still remember how to fix things around that house, and because, I think, some quiet part of her hoped I might forgive her. I worked through the heat of those August afternoons, replacing rotted posts, resetting fence panels, repairing the gutters that hung loose from the eaves. Margaret would bring out glasses of iced tea and sit on the porch steps, watching me work in a silence that slowly, day by day, softened into conversation. She asked about my business, about whether I'd found happiness since Claire. I asked, carefully, about her health, and she admitted, almost in a whisper, that the doctors had found something in her heart that scared her more than she let on. She said she didn't want to burden Claire with it, not when her daughter was finally building a life of her own. There was a moment on the third day, as I was securing the final fence post into the ground, when Margaret came outside holding an old photograph. It was a picture of Claire and me from years before, taken at a barbecue in this very backyard, both of us laughing at something long forgotten. She said she'd found it while cleaning out a drawer, and she'd almost thrown it away, but something stopped her. She told me she'd been wrong about me, that she had let her own fears about Claire's future cloud her judgment about who I really was. She said watching me come back to help her, after everything, after every cold word she'd once thrown at me, had shown her more character than any law degree ever could. Her voice broke on the last words, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw Margaret cry. I didn't know what to say, so I simply kept working, giving her the privacy to gather herself, the way you give anyone room to feel something big without an audience. When the fence was finished, standing straight and strong against the afternoon light, she asked me to sit with her on the porch. She told me she wanted to make things right, not just with words, but with something real. She said she'd spoken to a friend who ran a small business association in town, and that she wanted to help me get connected with bigger clients, homeowners, and developers who could take my business to a level I hadn't imagined reaching alone. She said it wasn't charity, it was recognition, long overdue, of the kind of man she should have seen from the beginning. I want to pause here and ask you something. If this story has touched you even a little, if you've ever had to rebuild a bridge you thought was burned forever, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below. Your support means more than you know, and it helps stories like this one reach people who need a reminder that redemption is always possible. Over the following weeks, Margaret kept her word. She introduced me to people who changed the trajectory of my small business, connections that turned into contracts, contracts that turned into a reputation I'd spent years struggling to build alone. But more than the business, what changed was something quieter, something harder to name. Margaret and I began to talk regularly, not out of obligation, but because we'd found an unexpected friendship in the wreckage of what once divided us. She started calling just to check in, to ask how a project was going, to share a recipe she thought I'd like. I found myself driving out to see her on weekends, not to fix anything, but simply to sit with her, to listen to stories about her late husband, to be present in a way her own daughter, caught up in a distant life, no longer could be. One evening, months after that first phone call, Claire reached out to me herself. She'd heard from her mother about everything that happened, and she wanted to thank me, though her voice carried a complicated mixture of gratitude and regret. I told her there was nothing to thank me for, that sometimes people find their way back to each other in forms you never expect, not as lovers, but as something quieter and just as meaningful. Claire and I never rekindled what we'd lost, and I think we both understood that some doors close for good reasons. But Margaret and I found something neither of us anticipated, a friendship built not on old wounds, but on the simple, stubborn decision to show up for someone who once wrote you off. Before I close this story, I want to ask one small thing of you. If you have a moment, drop a comment below and tell me about a time someone surprised you with kindness you never expected, or a time you found the strength to forgive someone who hurt you. I read every single comment, and I promise you, your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Margaret is still with us, her heart holding on stronger than her doctors predicted, and every few weeks I still drive out to that house with the fence I built standing tall against the seasons. Some bridges, it turns out, are worth rebuilding, not because the past demands it, but because the people on the other side deserve the chance to become someone new. If this story moved you even a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one waiting to remind us that grace, given freely, has a way of finding its way back to us when we least expect it.